Hey, welcome to Electric Libertyland, episode number 180's pre-roll, where I want to just point out some of the fine work that my compatriots and I have been doing here at Lions of Liberty in the hopes that you will support us by virtue of our Patreon, which can be found at patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. Now, if you've been following along, you're seeing that we're tackling some very important issues. These surround race, these surround guns, these surround police departments, these surround the state's influence on our everyday lives, how that impacts people of all colors and creeds. And we are doing our best to communicate the ideals of liberty and provide practical solutions. You might have seen John Odermatt's 7 tenets that he wants to move forward for police reform. That got a lot of attention everywhere. It got republished on Being Libertarian. Jason Stapleton was talking about it. And you also see that Mark's bringing in some of the leaders of the movement like Joe Jorgensen. We're doing the stuff that we think matters, and we hope that you think it matters too. So again, you can support us for as little as $5 a month at patreon.com/Lions of Liberty.
Welcome to Electric Libertyland, here on the Lions of Liberty podcast, your weekly shot of culture, comedy, and liberty with your host, Brian McWilliams.
Hey everybody, welcome to Electric Libertyland, episode 180. Oh, another tough week, huh guys? Another tough one out there. Hopefully none of your businesses are on fire. Hopefully none of your businesses were looted. Hopefully your house made it safely through. And hopefully your social media feed hasn't been a scene of riots like my own was. If you listened to my episode last week with our Lion of Liberty, our fellow Lion, J.B. Lubin, you would have heard about my Facebook feed blowing up because of my outside-the-box posts about how people probably should not be looting and that they are, in fact, different from protesters. But anyway, this show this week is going to actually fulfill the promise of talking about culture, which I think, I do fairly often, but I want to get a little bit more into the culture side of things. And as such, I have a guest today who harkens back to my past, actually, my theatrical, culturally relevant past, wherein I was, in fact, an actor in a play called Horse Country. And we're going to get a little bit more into that when I bring the guest on. But yes, in my past, back in my collegiate years, I was, in fact, an actor. I went to college at Penn State. I got in on the benefits of my acting ability. And for 2 years, I was a thespian. And let me tell you, dealing with theater people, actors specifically, not the writers. Writers are fine. Writers are always fine. But the actors, oh my God. Talk about the most grating people on the face of the entire earth. I mean, people that never shut up. People that have to be constantly on, yelling, singing, doing something. And I don't know, doing massage circles. So that part was okay. But for the most part, just dealing with people who had very little self-awareness, very low self-confidence, I find is the overarching theme of the acting class. Zero self-confidence and thus constantly needing, craving attention, compliments, reassurances, something to fill the gaping void. Anyway, I was with these people as one of them. And for 2 years I did it, got rave reviews, A's in all my acting classes, right? And meanwhile, I know that being a judge of anything, as far as art or performance is concerned, is subjective. So I'm going along, 2 years in, I hit this one class, and this class was I'll call it refereeing because basically, again, like I said, you're not really teaching per se as much as having people read scenes and giving them your feedback, which is subjective. But this man was famous for basically 2 things. Being an FBI agent, he was like a black guy, probably in his 50s. He had been an FBI agent in several films. I don't know why he got cast as FBI agent. So like in Die Hard, he was like one of the FBI agents as Die Hard with a Vengeance sitting in the car. That, and for those of you who remember this, and a lot of you youngins might not, there was a commercial, black couples in bed, right? It's a Scope commercial. The wife turns over to kiss the husband, and he covers his mouth, and he goes, "Oh, no, baby, no, no, no." So that guy was my acting teacher. And the ego on this motherfucker could not be believed. You would have thought that he had starred on Broadway. You would have thought that he had his own series of films that, named after him. Scope Man. No. This guy had been in a commercial that he must probably made a decent amount of money off of. And he had been third, fourth tier parts in a couple of big films. Yet this man sat in judgment of me and clearly did not like me. I don't know why. Didn't like me. But there's a couple scenes I remember. One scene, we're supposed to be tiptoeing across, right? Somebody's sleeping, and the other person's supposed to sneak up to them, right? And like surprise them. And so I'm trying to sneak across this floor in the black box room that all these acting classes take place in. And I got big honking feet, and I'm a big tall guy. So as I'm walking, the bones in my feet are cracking, and there's nothing I could do. There's no amount of acting technique that I can learn that's going to stop my feet from cracking. But clearly he was infuriated by this, infuriated by my cracking feet. That's one thing I remember. Second thing I remember is there was a scene where I was supposed to be playing a guy with a gun, and the way I interpreted the character, as is my right as an artist, is that I was like, okay, I'm going to use this gun. I'm not going to respect this gun as a weapon of deadly means. I'm going to play it as though I'm so over the top, I'm so irreverent as to my own life or death that I don't treat this gun with respect. I'm putting it to my head, and these are intentional choices, mind you. This isn't a frivolous decision. So I'm waving it around like a madman, literally like a madman would, who has no concern for his own life, nor the person who I'm threatening. Thus, even more frightening, I would argue, if one has no fear of death and no regard for life or death. After the scene's over, all he can do is talk about the fact that I put the gun to my head. And I explained to him that was a choice, which he responded, he goes, well, I don't agree with it. Oh, you don't agree with my artistic choice, you fucking hack? So the guy, you need to get a B or better to advance in the acting program at Penn State. They gave this guy that authority as gatekeeper, this scope, oh no and famous dingleberry. They gave him this power over advancement or ceasing your advancement, and you had to take the class again. He gave me a C+. And there was no way I was taking that class again. And thus ended my career formally as an actor. As far as education is concerned, I switched to writing, a far more noble pursuit and far more intellectual pursuit, in my opinion. But I did find my way into the acting realm once more when I got to Los Angeles, because like so many other people, I moved here trying to write. Harder to get into writing than acting. By far harder to get into, because there aren't the extra roles. The extra role in writing is being a PA for a television show, and those jobs are even harder to get than the writing jobs because there's less of them. They're more in demand because everybody's trying to get them. So I'm putzing around. I'm working, at a tea bar, making dumplings in the back, because I was a chef, cook for a lot of years. And my buddy Dan Mahoney, who's a member of the Pride, comes up and he goes, hey, look, there's going to be a play. My buddy Matt Wells, who I knew was making it. He goes, I'd love to do it with you, because he and I go back. We were in high school together. We were in a lot of plays together. Good friends. So I said, okay, great, let's do it. Turns out this play's Horse Country. I auditioned for the role, got it. And we went on and did, I think it was like a 5 or 6 week run. And good crowds came out, had a lot of fun. I didn't tell my guest, CJ Hopkins, who I'm going to bring on in a minute. I should have told him this story and I forgot. So CJ, as you listen to this, I hope you appreciate this. But the very last time we did the play, we had done it, you do it so many times that you learn it inside out. And you don't really have to think about it. And that's really where your performances become the best, is when you don't have to think about the next line. And within Horse Country, the cadences, and there's a lot of callbacks and a lot of things, they can be similar. So you can you have to concentrate on what you're saying so you don't accidentally leap forward to another part, which happened at one point in one of the shows, I think in week 2, as we accidentally skipped a part of the show and we went off on this other line that was 10 minutes down the road, none the wiser, and then realized that what we had done, and there was no going back at that point. But anyway, this last show, we had a bottle of whiskey on there. We're trying to drink in this whiskey, and it's fake the entire time. But the last show, we decided we're going to use real whiskey, and I'll be goddamned if it wasn't the absolute best show that we did of the entire run. So anyway, that's my story. That's the background. That's why I really am excited to bring on my guest. All right, as mentioned, I am joined by author, playwright, columnist, publisher, CJ Hopkins, who, as I mentioned in my intro earlier, I'm very excited to have on the show because he's a man who actually wrote the play, which I was in Los Angeles back in my days when I thought that acting was still a thing that I should partake in before I changed my interesting and creative bent towards writing and, of course, podcasting. And that is CJ Hopkins. Welcome to Electric Libertyland.
Hey, pleasure to be here, Brian. Thanks.
Yeah. So, I mentioned horse country. I wanted to start off before we get into the heavier topics. Just, it's funny that I reached out to you on Twitter because a buddy of mine, Dan Mahoney, who was in horse country with me, and horse country is a fascinating play. I did it. It was like 15 years now, I think, since I was in it. So I'm trying to bring up what the finer aspects of the play, and I'll let you go into that. But it's an interesting vaudevillian approach. It's a kind of an absurdist play that goes into, I guess, American life, capitalism, whether or not certain values stay strong. I mean, how would you describe horse country? Because it's definitely a tough play to approach and get into, but one that I really enjoyed being in. It was kind of fascinating to see the audience reaction and also just try to give it the due it deserved.
Well, horse country has been notoriously difficult to describe or to create blurbs for over the years. The shortest blurb that I've ever come up with is that it's basically Abbott and Costello on acid. It is all of the things that you just mentioned, Brian. Artistically, it was me sort of struggling with the existence and the monumental work of Samuel Beckett, and just wondering, where do you go in the theater after Samuel Beckett? And politically, I think it's just kind of the same theme that has run through all of my work, which is sort of about authoritarianism and I don't want to say mind control, but just ideology in the way that our opinions are formed and shaped, and what it takes to break out of them sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell me a little bit about your background too. I mean, how did you come to arrive? And we were talking a little bit before we started hitting record about where you would align politically. Obviously, I'm a libertarian. You said that you were as libertarian as you are anything else. So what has shaped your worldview to bring you to this point? And then we'll use that as a jumping off point to get into your current work with Consent Factory. Because I want to talk about the name Consent Factory too, because I think that'll be something that I'll enjoy hearing about.
Yeah. Politically, it sounds like I'll just take your question politically. And, politically, I grew up sort of, just politically ignorant, really, in South Florida. And it was my ex-wife who dragged me back into the theater, found me in San Francisco, dragged me back into the theater, and also kind of awakened me politically. I usually describe myself as some kind of leftist. I don't really know what that means anymore.
Yeah.
These days I'm not really comfortable with most of what people think of as leftism these days. But I still am, a leftist to a certain degree, and for example, I enjoy living here in Germany, in Berlin, where everybody gets to have an affordable education and a university education, and everybody has health care. And I'm glad and I believe that if there's going to be a government, that the government has the responsibility to provide those basic things to all of its citizens. At the same time, I think, there's definitely a lot of libertarianism running through my mentality as well. I don't know, pick your topic, and, guns, I think people should be allowed to have them. I think basically that the government should be as non-intrusive as absolutely possible, and leave people the most individual freedom that is absolutely possible to still have a civilized society.
Yeah, I would agree. Now, how did you end up in Berlin? Because obviously going from South Florida to San Francisco to Berlin is quite the trek. And because I was surprised when I saw where you were based and where you're writing from, and obviously things in Germany and Berlin have mirrored quite a bit of what's going on in the United States, and to a little bit of a shocking degree when we talk about the Floyd stuff, which we'll get to in a bit. But how did you end up in Berlin?
Another long story, and this is what happens when you get old, is everything becomes a long story. But I'll try to make it as short as possible. As I said, I grew up in Miami in South Florida, and this was, back in the late 70s, early 80s before, Miami became more of a cultural hotspot. And at that time, it really wasn't. So basically, as soon as I figured that I was free to leave and had the means to do so, I took off for San Francisco. And I was going to be a beat poet. I was going to go out there like Jack Kerouac and be a beat poet.
You had already gotten your beret. You've bought all your black turtlenecks. You had the whole thing.
All that. And so I was out there for a few years writing really bad poetry. And then, as I say, I met my ex-wife, and she's a theater director. She pulled me back into the theater, and then, soon enough, we were out in California. We figured, okay, we're theater artists. We've got to go to New York City. So ended up working, off Broadway and downtown in New York City for 15 years. And basically got lucky, with Horse Country in 2002 overseas in Scotland, at the Edinburgh Festival, and won a bunch of awards. And then things, my work started to spread out a little bit more internationally. And once again, I realized that I was free to leave New York City. Didn't need to stay there in my terribly expensive, closet that I was living in. And I wanted to, I wanted to get out of the States. I wasn't real happy there after September 11th and all of the cultural changes that came into being. And Berlin was really the easiest city in Europe for me to try to set up camp in. At that time, it was quite easy for an American to move to Berlin and get a residency permit and set up shop. Mm-hmm. And here I am, all these years later.
Well, obviously you enjoy your city there, and I've never had the chance to go to Berlin. A few years ago, I had had a planned trip to Germany, which unfortunately I couldn't follow through with. But you said you moved away from the United States following 9/11, and obviously the authoritarian, intrusive policies as far as NSA spying, domestic issues. How does that shape up as far as Germany? I know Germany and the United States were working in tandem with with what Edward Snowden had exposed, our two secret deep state alliances. But how is it there compared to the United States? If you had to give a 30-second synopsis, is it better? Is it worse? Is it efficiently the same?
It's the same and different. In one sense, Germany, Germany is, in a sense, still under occupation by the United States, or
true.
Or by the Western powers. It's a part of that nexus of Western power, and pretty much goes along with whatever the United States is doing. On the other hand, I live in Berlin, which is not really Germany. Berlin is to Germany as New York used to be to the rest of of the United States, and so Berlin has just a unique history that's impossible to describe in 30 seconds. But it is much more libertarian, if you will, much more anti-authoritarian.
Well, I guess, like you said, considering the history there, you would imagine that people would have a distinct anti-authoritarian streak and more of a bent towards libertarianism and probably capitalism. I mean, going from a split society into one that's merged together and seeing the benefits that a free market, or at least somewhat of a free market, can provide, an open culture and open sharing of information. So, yeah, I would imagine.
I think it's more of a general anti-authoritarianism in Berlin. There's there's the remnants of, they call them the 68 generation, who would probably be more opposed to capitalism and more opposed to all of that. And then, of course, there's also the folks who grew up under the DDR, the GDR. And so I would describe it as a general anti-authoritarianism. Anything that bridles of the government or the state, clamping down on people is not met with, a lot of happiness here.
Sounds like a lovely place to live. So tell me a little bit about Consent Factory. So Consent Factory is a website. You could go to consentfactory.org and find all of CJ's your blog posts, your essays. You can also find your books, Trumpocalypse, and also Zone 23, which I'm currently reading, and we'll come back to that at the end of the show. Why Consent Factory as a name?
Obviously inspired by Chomsky, and his seminal book with Edward Herman, Manufacturing Consent. And what Consent Factory is, don't tell anyone, Brian. It's a big secret. The Consent Factory is really just a separate organization that I have nothing to do with, except for the fact that it's my blog and that I own it. I set it up in, I think in 2016, which is really when I started writing my political satire and my essays. Before that, I was just really focused on my artistic work. And I really got engaged during the 2016 campaign because I started paying just attention to the intense propaganda machine that was operating at the time. And so that's really what Consent Factory is focused on is just the propaganda that we are all being bombarded with, constantly in the West, and hopefully trying to cut through some of it and present a little bit of analysis.
And so I didn't have a chance to read the Trumpocalypse essays. So it was a series of essays which you had then comprised and put into a book format, which is available to buy on your website and I think on Amazon. So tell me a little bit about that. And also, I'm curious to see how that has evolved from 2016 until now. When you talk about the propagandization, sometimes my brain gets ahead of my mouth there, of society, and I couldn't agree more in that regard. But having not read the essays, I mean, what was your take on what you saw unfolding during the election and in the aftermath?
Before I answer your question, Brian, let me just a couple of things. First of all, don't make me say that word. Propaganda is the issue.
Possible.
And second of all, people can get my book anywhere. They can get it on Amazon or, a bookstore or IndieBound, or basically just walk into any bookstore and ask for it and order it. My take on the whole thing, a lot of people are kind of confused about my take on the whole thing. I'm not a Donald Trump fan. Never have been. Lived in the same city with the man for many, many years.
Right. We have to put that precursor on everything in society today, right?
So I got to get this disclaimer in, pretty much everywhere. Nonetheless, what my take on the whole thing is what we began to see in 2016, really first with the Brexit and then with the Trump's campaign, and to a degree with Bernie Sanders, is this sort of populist backlash, I think, against globalized capitalism. Though my take on the whole thing, and see if I can get it somewhat concise, in 1989 or 1990, the last real ideological, adversary to globalized capitalism disappeared. That was the end of the USSR, right? From then on, it has been one big global capitalist world. And what has been happening since then is global capitalism has been restructuring the planet, primarily in the Middle East, but also in the former Soviet bloc and so on. And that's what we've been witnessing. Since then, there really aren't any outside adversaries. All of the adversaries are internal. The first ones were terrorists, naturally. The terrorists and the extremists. These are internal adversaries. And what happened in 2016 is we started to see a populist backlash coming from the people who were just, I think, kind of fed up with, austerity in the UK. I'm not sure what to call it in the US. And a lot of the values that are being rammed down people's throats as well. And this populist backlash bubbled up. And I think the American people basically elected Donald Trump. Can I curse on your show?
Oh, please, have at it.
Yeah, I think the American people. There's a theory in the professional left, that basically Donald Trump was elected because most Americans are white supremacists, who worship Adolf Hitler.
Despite Barack Obama being in office for the previous 8 years,
For 8 years, That's not my theory. My theory is that Donald Trump got elected as just sort of a big fuck you to the entire system that was represented by Clinton, Obama, and the whole gang. And I think people were just like, no, we're not going to suck on another 8 years of these people. And so we're going to elect, this clown if we have to.
Well, I mean, I think it closely mirrors. I mean, look at the Ukrainian president. They literally elected a comedian, and that's where for better or worse, I thought for better. But I'm happy with the Libertarian candidate, which is Jo Jorgensen, a female doctorate who's a lecturer at Clemson. Very well-established, intelligent woman. But I had actually supported a character, a living meme named Vermin Supreme. And I'm not sure if you've ever heard of him.
Yes, I have. I just followed him on Twitter the other day.
Oh, okay, fantastic. So I had basically taken that theory, though, because I agree with it, that it was an anti-establishment, fuck you to the system and fuck you to everybody, which really ushered Donald Trump in. I think combined with also a back of the mind fear that people did have, and I would say probably middle of the country, white America, as far as a worry about immigration, as you said, a worry about global capitalization and capitalism and outsourcing and them not having jobs, which Trump, he tapped into that. But in that vein of some people are just going to want the outsider and want to have something completely different. I had supported Vermin Supreme, and he got fairly far in the nominating process before, unfortunately, being eliminated. But to your point, I think people are seeing far more, and it's being exposed. I think one of the good things about Donald Trump is we're seeing, by virtue of his calling out the media, calling out the deep state on certain things and the reaction to it, that he is exposing some of the thought control devices and exposing, God, the entire Russia collusion thing could not be more transparently bullshit. And yet you have half of the country completely buying into it and having, Trump derangement syndrome, of course, is the phrase du jour, but I can't think of a better term for it. So, is that something that you were covering when you were writing? And do you think that's come about more predominantly in current day? Like, do you think people are waking up or not?
I don't know if people are waking up. It's absolutely something that I was covering, and it's covered in that book. The second volume will be out sometime soon. It's what I've been covering in all of my essays. Another thing you just mentioned it, Brian, and I think is very interesting. You mentioned the issue of immigration and the nationalism, obviously, that Trump is selling. And again, in the professional, leftist world that I swim in, this is, there's only one possible position that one can take on this. And here again, where my analysis has been a bit heretical, because when I look at that, you can look at that and say, okay, these are xenophobic people who want to, who hate foreigners and blah, blah, blah. Or what you can look at is really what's happening is as globalized capitalism is spreading, part of what it's doing is it's eroding and dissolving national sovereignty. Mm-hmm. I don't think Brexit was a racist, hysterical reaction. I think that underlying a lot of these things that are being labeled xenophobic and labeled racist, I think underlying all of these things is a recognition on the part of people that what's happening is that nation states are dissolving and they're losing their sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And more power is being located in a very diffuse, global network that people don't really understand and don't really have any control over.
Well, especially in the case of Brexit, I think, leaving the European Union, I was reading quite a bit about that, and just the fact that people have no control over the officials that are dictating what regulations and what taxes and what can go in and out of borders. I mean, you could understand why people would rebel against that, and quite logically so. But the left that wanted to stay in the EU had positioned it as such, wherein you are racist. And that's, we see that across so many different topics now, where that cudgel of racism or xenophobia is used over and over again to reject anything, whether it's economical, whether it's cultural. It doesn't seem to matter. And there are no boundaries to what can be considered or wrapped into this blanket of xenophobia.
Yeah, one of the tropes that I use constantly in my essays and in the books and whatever is the Putin Nazis.
Yeah.
And basically what happened, is, this populist backlash emerged and rose up, and the basic globocap is what I call them for short, mm-hmm. Basically the response to it was to delegitimize it and demonize it, rather than, of course, from their perspective, there's no benefit in analyzing, why this resistance is rising up. And their response, it's been the last 4 years, I think, have been the most intense display of propaganda activity that I've ever lived through in my life. And a lot of it is it comes down to the reason I came up with this Putin Nazi trope. Is that's basically the two tracks that the establishment has been using to delegitimize and demonize people. It's, you mentioned Russiagate before, and of course it was ridiculous to anyone, who was actually thinking and paying attention. But the fact is that it has been incredibly effective. People still to this day, will, respond to other people by saying, it's like, oh, where are you? You're based in Moscow, or, as if there are Russian agents everywhere, trying to undermine America. And the other track has been the fascism hysteria. Mm-hmm. These are the two tracks that the establishment has been pushing relentlessly for 4 years, whipping up Russia hysteria on one hand and fascism hysteria on the other hand. And God help me, but I know I'm in Berlin, I'm not in the United States, but it doesn't appear, that Trump has actually, launched the Fourth Reich or anything.
No, it is amazing. I was watching a video actually just today. Some people had sent it to me of a woman hysterically calling out to the left and warning them about the impending Holocaust that Trump is going to be bringing upon us, because she got an email that was intended for a Trump fundraising PAC that said, "Hey, we're going to send you a camouflage MAGA hat, and we know that you're one of the dedicated that's going to push back against the left, the army of the left." And she's crying into the camera because she's convinced that Trump is in fact going to be forming an army and going to war against the minorities and the left and all these other things. And you do shake your head in wonder, because the average person, the impact Trump has had upon their life is negligible. The only impact he's really had on them is probably within their own minds, or possibly that their SALT deduction it changed, or they got more or less in a tax refund. Other than that, probably negligible. Yet they are so absolutely obsessed with the concept that he is the greatest evil that mankind has ever faced, that they can't see beyond it. And I think this is a very useful tool for so many things, because we're talking about global cap, right? And for me, for my libertarian bent, I believe in totally open and free markets. But as you talk about a lot in your book that I'm reading currently, in your essays, the the globalization and the capitalism within the worldwide system is in fact based a large part in crony capitalism, which nobody acknowledges. It seems like the left in power and the right in power are both very content to go along with it. And meanwhile, we have all these different distractions that are, happily put in front of us, COVID and racial issues and equality issues, constantly to keep us looking somewhere else, while wealth is siphoned away and inequality becomes even greater.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I put a lot of concepts into that one rant there. I apologize. I always do that. I kind of get going, and then I gotta. So
where was I going to jump in? Your concept, I'm not familiar enough with libertarianism. I know there's a distinction among libertarianisms between capitalism per se and crony capitalism. Mm-hmm. And I think it's probably, again, I am essentially a leftist. I don't see us taking an immediate leap into, beneficial socialism from where we are.
No, neither do I.
At the moment, but at the same time, I have a philosophical, opposition to capitalism. But I think part of the reason that when I use the term in my essays and just generally, I use the term global capitalism, because what I'm talking about really isn't, a guy with a store and 4 employees and, somebody who's got a machine shop and, 50 people running machines and stuff like that. This is not what I'm talking about. Right. I'm talking about the dominant global structure, governing power structure that exists in our world today, which, I don't have time or brain energy to try to explicate right here on your podcast. But I think it's probably closer to what you guys are describing as crony capitalism.
I would imagine that's why I mentioned in that way, is that it does seem, when we get into these macro levels of trade and economics, and it's the the government and the powers, the elite powers that be, really controlling how things are working out, who's benefiting and who's not getting the most of it. And it's always it's never to the benefit of the small businessman. It's never to the benefit of the entrepreneur. It's always to the benefit of the biggest of big businesses. It's enabled by government with excess regulation and hurdles to get into it, and tax breaks and all these other things.
And from my perspective, coming more from the left, you're talking about a machine. You're talking about a machine that dissolves national boundaries and, in a sense, creates a global working class. So that U.S. manufacturing can be offshored to China and Asia and various other places where wages are incredibly low and the protections aren't there. And so you end up with American workers competing with Chinese workers and Bangladeshi workers and what have you. And this system, that type of globalization leads to what we've got in the United States, which is a lot of people living in debt enslavement and unable to make enough money to feed their families and have a decent standard of living. Anyway, I started rambling on.
Oh no, it's okay. Well, I want to jump to actually. So I don't want to take up too much of your time. We'll try to keep it to about an hour because I know it's later there. So I wanted to jump to we're talking about propaganda and how you're seeing over the past 3 years, and God, especially within the past 3 months, the most absolute brazen use of propaganda against domestic populations that I've ever witnessed. And you've written quite a bit about COVID and what's going on with the coronavirus response, with the lockdowns and the expansion of the authoritarian state. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that. And 2 of your essays, I'll read. I'll let you talk about the overall concept behind them. And then I do want to read a quote specifically from, I believe, Virus of Mass Destruction, because you've written 3 essays recently: The Brave New Normal, Parts 1 and 2, and Virus of Mass Destruction. So tell me a little bit about what your overarching viewpoint is on this, and then I'll get into the quote.
It's such a maddening issue, Brian. It's another one of these completely polarized issues where everyone is at each other's throats on both sides. Where I came at it from the beginning was, I saw it starting to unfold, and I went looking for the solid data, the solid facts that justified the type of authoritarian measures that governments all over the world were putting into place. And I couldn't find them, I couldn't find it. And the more I looked, the more I couldn't find it. And then I started tracking just the mass hysteria and the propaganda that was being pumped out in the death trucks and the death ship that was being sent into the harbor and the, field hospitals that were being set up.
All of which seemed to treat nobody at the end of the day. Almost nobody.
They sat empty, and just the pure illogic, the idea that this is some new, Martian virus that doesn't behave like any other virus that's ever existed, and no one will develop immunity from it because you can't develop immunity, but we got to get a vaccine as soon as possible. To immunize you from this virus that you can't be immune to, and it's just the propaganda was absolutely intense, and the data, the facts were not there. There's one of the one of the outlets that republishes my essays, Off Guardian, have done a really excellent job at just kind of pushing for data and probing for details and kind of analyzing the data that was being put out there, and talking and collecting, other experts, the experts that weren't being foregrounded in the corporate media, who were expressing dissenting views. The facts, as they have been out there from the very beginning of this, and they just haven't matched the propaganda and the mass hysteria. Where we are right now, I think it's going to be a really, really weird period. I think people have slowly been realizing that it is propaganda and mass hysteria.
Well, half and half. Sorry, go ahead, continue.
It's and I think it was just yesterday the World Health Organization finally came out and said no, there is really the asymptomatic transmission is extremely rare.
Mm-hmm.
So again, there's no need for all of us healthy people to be walking around with masks on, and but at this point again, and this was in one of my essays. At this point, the narrative is completely divorced from the actual reality, and we're prisoners of the narrative.
Yeah, I agree completely. It does mirror in a way the same thing with the Trump and Russiagate. To go back to that, is that once people have latched onto this narrative, this mainstream narrative, it becomes its own demon. And then also it seems as though people are, and I see this happen politically, and this, of course, COVID became politicized as well, because it became a left versus right, where the right wanted to open up, and then the mask became a symbol of left versus right, at least in America, and people became so attached to their version of the narrative. And I think when you have a situation like this, where you're locked down, right, you're forced to give up your business, your economy is crumbling, 40 million people in the U.S. are out of work. When people accept that sort of authoritarian response and don't fight back against it, it's almost mentally, to protect your own ego, mentally in their best interest to say, I had to do this. And there was no other option. I couldn't have been wrong. Because to admit otherwise would mean that you have completely destroyed something, destroyed everything for no reason at all.
Exactly. And I think I made that point. That was the central point of one of my essays. It's and that's what I meant by it's going to get. It's weird now, and it's going to get even weirder because people are now going to be faced with the fact that there was never a real justification for the authoritarian measures that were put into place. Mm-hmm. For the police, the police were, body slamming, mothers and ripping their kids out of their arms, for not wearing their masks properly. Yeah. People are now going to be faced, or being faced, with the fact that of course there was absolutely no justification for the imposition of these type of measures. And so what are you going to do? It's like, Germans after the Second World War, and you ask them, what'd you do during the war, Dad?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me read a quick quote from I believe it's from Virus of Mass Destruction. And this is where, like we're talking about, I'll just read the quote. It's all right there in black and white. They aren't hiding the totalitarianism. They don't have to, because people are begging for it. They are demanding to be locked down inside their homes, forced to wear masks and stand 2 meters apart for reasons that most of them no longer remember. Plastic barriers are going up everywhere. Arrows on the floor show you which way to walk. Boxes show you where to stand. Paranoid block warts are putting up signs threatening anyone not wearing a mask. Hysterical little fascist creeps are reporting their neighbors to the police for letting their children play with other children. There's more to that. I'll skip ahead a little bit, but the internet has become an Orwellian chorus of shrieking, sanctimonious voices, bullying everyone into conformity with charts, graphs, and desperate guilt trips, few of which have connection to reality. Corporations and governments are censoring dissent. We're approaching a level of manufactured mass hysteria and herd mentality that not even Goebbels would have imagined. And I read that, and I do, again, compliments to your writing style, which I greatly enjoy. But it ties into what we're talking about. And also, I wonder, at some point, we're talking about the tactics being used, people being trained to follow and conform and go in the box and go in the arrow, and they've gone along with it and are begging for more, and they're turning on their neighbors, 1984-esque style. On some level, do you wonder, I don't get into conspiracy theory. That's not really my thing. But on some level, I do wonder, how far governments would go to condition people mentally to accept this type of thing, and whether or not they knew, how early did they know that this was all nonsense, and did they continue to go along and to condition people? I mean, do you buy into that sort of thinking at all?
I don't tend to get very conspiracist myself. I tend to see things more systematically. I've never really been interested in, in finding the guys who are sitting in the room, making
the smoking man. And,
Yeah, I don't think things work that way. I think what happens is that everyone who is in a position of power they don't need. There doesn't need to be a conspiracy. They don't need, someone to call them up and tell them what to do. They know what to do.
Yeah.
The government knows what to do. The media knows what to do. The pundits know what to do. The academics and the culture industry, they know what to do, and what to do is conform.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing systemically, regardless of where it's coming from and how orchestrated it is just, and you mentioned you're reading Zone 23, and it's basically where I'm coming from with that, is just this massive campaign to generate and reinforce conformity to whatever. It's like it almost doesn't matter, and in some ways it's like the thing that we are supposed to conform to, the more ridiculous, the better. It's like, no, we really need you to believe that Vladimir Putin is running Donald Trump, as a Russian asset. He's been a sleeper agent in New York City, all this stuff. No. We need you to believe that there's a completely new Martian virus, that doesn't operate in any of the ways that we know viruses operate, or anything. And it's going to just kill you, if you walk within 20 feet of, it. You know what I'm saying? Is the narratives, it's almost designed to test, people's conformity, their willingness to conform to the most ridiculous things. I'm here in Berlin, and the lockdown has been eased, and people are going back to normal life, and it's very interesting to watch how quickly. And again, it's Berlin, so people abandon the masks, immediately. But there are still people walking around, with masks, and I'm not talking about old people or people who are obviously infirm. I'm talking about perfectly healthy young people who are out jogging with masks on.
Oh yeah, or riding in their cars alone with masks on.
Yes, driving alone in their cars.
What are you doing?
With masks on? One thing that's interesting is and we have to wear masks if we want to go into a grocery store.
Right. Yeah, that's too.
We can't buy food without masks. It's the law in Germany. And so on the front of my mask, I have written the phrase "Befehl ist Befehl." And what this means is it's the phrase that the Nazis used in Nuremberg when they were saying we were just following orders.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
It means an order is an order. And so it's really kind of offensive and provocative for me to have this on the front of my mask.
Hey guys, I want to tell you about a brand new sponsor we have here at the Lions of Liberty. They have come aboard, longtime listeners who run the company called Lorenzotti Coffee. Now, Lorenzotti Coffee is from a couple of coffee lovers who ended up in Utah, of all places, and couldn't find a good cup of coffee or an authentic Italian espresso to save their lives. So they went on their way to find a roaster in Naples who would work with them and start importing that coffee, which turned into Lorenzotti. So they found there's a market for the coffee themselves, but also a lot of entrepreneurial people out there who wanted to start their own coffee shops. So they decided this is going to be incorporated in their business. So they're working with people to get equipment. They're financing it. They rent it out, help them with maintenance, help them with all these different things. So these guys are not only libertarians who are helping us out, helping to spread the message of liberty. And of course, Zachary Muse is who I'd like to thank personally for reaching out and getting this going. But they're also helping other entrepreneurs to do it as well. So for a great cup of coffee, I want you to use the code LIONS and go to lorenzotti.coffee. That's LORENZOTTI.coffee. And use that promo code. You're going to get 10% off. And make sure, by the way, you order at least 2 tins of coffee because it's free shipping for orders over $15. Doesn't make much sense to order just 1 tin. And enjoy that cup of coffee. Start your day with a roar and help some libertarians while you're at it. What is the response to that from the people? Are people nodding along with it? Do they overall get it, or do some people treat you as though you've broken a taboo?
That's exactly where I was going. Watching the responses to it has been fascinating because some people smile and nod and wink, right? And they get it. And other people look at me as if, I am Satan, with horns shooting up out of the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing how this has split people so thoroughly. And then, you get into, and I know that I think Berlin's had the same kind of response to George Floyd's killing, but we're looking at the transition from COVID lockdown America and COVID lockdown the world over, wherein we're being forced to stay home and shutter our businesses and alter the very way that we live, which I think is highly dangerous for social animals like people are in general. And I think that a lot of what's happened post-COVID with these responses and the protesting and the rioting and everything else is a response to the lockdown as much as it is to what actually happened with George Floyd. But it's fascinating to watch the split where people who were telling you can't go out without a mask, you're going to kill people, you're literally, as they said, you're going to kill grandma, you have medical workers up in arms and getting applauded in the streets that now have said, we believe that rioting and protesting is more important than COVID, so go out and do it. And it just could not be more blatantly an absolute reversal of positions and almost overnight.
It's Brian, it's more than a reversal of positions. It's psychotic.
Yeah.
It's what it is. It really is. And it's the kind of thing that drives people mad. If you spend 3 months, basically disseminating a reality, say, folks, this is the reality. There's this killer virus and everyone has to stay home and we have to have, police on the beach to arrest people, if they try to, because this virus is so dangerous and, so deadly and everything. And then in the course of 1 or 2 days, right, to completely say, no, it's great that everyone go out and, and mingle, which is basically saying that whole reality that we just spent so long introducing and getting you to conform to, that whole reality, we just turned it off like a switch, right? Yep. We just turned that reality off like a switch. And now the reality is completely the opposite. There's no problem. No, go out and, protest and, burn some stores down and stuff. That's all completely fine. No COVID worries there.
Yep.
And what I'm waiting for is for them to flip the switch back.
Oh, yeah, well, they will. They'll say that the second wave that's now coming because of the riots, which were absolutely necessary because killing people for this cause is better than killing people for the cause of people's businesses or whatever you might think, or freedom. They will without a doubt flip it and say that the second wave now mandates a new lockdown. I mean, I can already see it happening. I can already see the news headlines being written.
And Brian, what we're really talking about, I mean, the reason that I mentioned, psychosis is this is exactly the type of stuff cult leaders do in order to break down people's minds and generate conformity, and submissiveness to the cult. Yeah. This is exactly what you do, is you change reality back and forth on people until their minds snap.
Right. Yeah. How many lights do you see? I see 2 lights. No, beat him. Okay, how many lights do you see now? Okay, 3 lights. Okay. It's exactly right. And, talking a little bit more about the George Floyd protests and what's going on, you wrote an article recently called The Minneapolis Putsch. And you talk about how it's interesting that people are, accusing the other side of that which you were guilty, how the resistance have been telling everybody that Trump is literally Hitler and that he's been fomenting racial hatred and white supremacists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But now it looks like we've instead seen the media. Let's see, I'm trying to, I'm getting off. I'm totally confusing my own point. Yeah.
I got you, Brian, because
I'm trying to scan to see where I was trying to end up, but if you get it, they'll go with it.
I got you, Brian. I'm right in the middle of writing a follow-up essay to that last essay, and I'm just getting credible amounts of shit for.
Oh, I'm sure you are
on this because what I'm seeing, and let me again put this disclaimer right out in the front. There is an organic protest uprising here. Of course, there is. There has been often the cops have killed a lot of black people over the years, and very often after the cops kill a black person, there are protests and there are riots and people rise up, and that is absolutely organic, and there's nothing staged about it. It's an understandable phenomenon that occurs. That being said, what we are witnessing here, pretty obviously, is the result of that 4 solid years of propaganda and mass hysteria that I was talking about before. This is the result of that. They have been telling us that Trump is, a racist Hitler who wants to murder all the Jews and the black people and the Mexicans for 4 years solid. And many of them have been very specific in saying Trump is waiting to create a Reichstag event, and he's going to then declare himself dictator and declare martial law and roll out the tanks. And, when you look at what has happened here, and again, there's an authentic organic, protest uprising at the center of it. But all around it, if you look at it, what you're seeing is just a classic regime change op in progress.
Exactly.
Really not that different than, Tunisia and Egypt and the attempt in Venezuela and so on. What you're seeing is the result of 4 years of relentless conditioning.
Right.
Yeah. It took, 24 hours for these protests to mushroom into international protests and rioting.
Right. No coincidence.
Focused not really so much on the cops as on Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, it's like I had posted, I think, and maybe even after reading your article, I had posted a screed on Twitter going off and just chastising people, the anti-Trump people for trying to associate Donald Trump with, specifically with this is his fault. Completely disregarding the fact that both parties on the left and the right have for years gone down the same road of militarization of police, of over-policing, of engaging and raising up the drug war, which disproportionately affects black communities. I mean, all these things are equal parts. They're both complicit in this attack on basic humanity, but also that's disproportionately affected black people. And what I really liked from your piece, and this is what I was scanning and trying to skip down for, and I finally found it, is that I liked that you finished this this piece kind of saying, look, I'm chastising the people that are in the quote unquote resistance. I'm not chastising, like we're talking about, the organic black people that do have an issue with how they're being policed and how they are being treated in America and other countries. But you said, you're chastising the people who are cheering the rioting and looting, who are coming out to quote unquote help you with it, but who will be back home in their gated communities when the ashes have cooled and the corporate media are gone and the cops return to police your neighborhoods. And that I thought was absolutely perfectly stated, because that's the way that's the kind of the point that I'm trying to make. And libertarians and also people like yourself and classic liberals have been trying to communicate for decades, is that there is an issue with police, and there is an issue with the way in which the society is looking and treating certain communities and the way that they are being treated legally, culturally, etc. And to pinpoint this and try to peg it on Donald Trump and root for rioting and looting and the stake of equality and justice, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's absurd, and it's also insulting to people that are trying to address the root cause, because it completely distracts from it, and people will, in fact, forget it and move on, having done their virtue signaling on social media, and then we'll go back into comfort.
And absolutely, and just mention again, I mean, people should know this. I don't know, they remember it, but there's a long list of black guys that were killed by the cops, during the Obama years,
for sure.
Obama years, and there was protest, and there were protests, and there was rioting after that, which did not explode into a huge, international, uprising. And
right. When Eric Garner was killed, you didn't have this response, despite the fact that you could argue that it was a very similar circumstance.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember people storming the White House.
No, I don't remember that either.
I don't remember, former CIA director and, former generals and military agents and the entirety of the liberal corporate media immediately, pumping out headlines and statements indicating that Trump is a dictator or I'm sorry, Obama at that time. Obama is a dictator and Obama needs to be removed. And, it's all of this, it just follows its textbook regime change propaganda. And, what I hope people will do is look back at history and, look at the responses during the Obama years and look at the response this time and be able to separate that organic, authentic, protest uprising from the larger, propaganda operation, regime change operation that has been attempted.
Well, I do question whether or not people have, I mean, at this point, it's like we were talking about conditioning. People are so conditioned to believe what the media is pumping out there that I don't know if they're going to be able to wake up. I mean, thank God for the internet. Thank God for, sites like Off Guardian, for Consent Factory, for this podcast, even getting various ways to reach people out there that aren't this mainstream media. And I think we're seeing some erosion of that. But then, I just was watching today, J.K. Rowling has now been, I guess she's trying to be canceled because she had some comments about, we don't have to get into whether or not you agree or not with her statements, but basically on biological gender being a thing. And she didn't come out and try to say anything cruel about trans people or say that she doesn't support your right to be transgender, but just simply stating that she believes in biological gender. Now you have the internet coming at her, teeth and nails, bared, and you see the cancel culture for almost anybody can come and get you. What do you think about cancel culture? Is this something that we're seeing be intentionally manipulated to forward these specific narratives? Like we're saying, throwing out these these eccentric positions that you cannot dare to question, the mob will come after you.
Okay, I'll get a little philosophical on you again, Brian, because this taps directly back into my whole analysis of global capitalism spreading all over the globe and resistance to it. One thing at the essence is, and it also gets to to my philosophical problem with capitalism. What basically the way I see capitalism, not economically, not as a structure to manufacture things and sell them and what have you, but as a ruling system, and that's what we have now. Capitalism has transformed from an economic system into a power system, into a government system, and what capitalism basically does is it goes into territories that are coded. Mm-hmm. And it decodes those territories of their values, right? So if you have a religious territory, for example, Middle East, Islamic culture, what capitalism needs to do in order to populate and exploit that culture is it needs to decode and get rid of all those religious values. It's okay if people still go to the mosque and still have pictures of Muhammad up in their house and stuff like that. But it's more or less like the United States. You can go to church and you can, pray on Sundays and do all of your stuff, as long as you're actually living according to the values of capitalism, not according to the values of Christianity or according to the values of Islam. Mm-hmm. So what capitalism does, it needs to do, is it needs to erase all of these old despotic values. And I say despotic values not to be negative, but they're values that come down from an authority, from a king, from a priest, from a culture that says this is the way we are, these are our values, and this is what we want them to be because we want them to be that way. What capitalism needs to do is erase all of those values, and replace them with one value, which is exchange value, which is commodity value, where everything becomes a commodity. You mentioned the whole transgender issue and the cancel culture and what have you. And the way that I read that, I read that as exactly this global capitalist machine dissolving more values. There's no such thing as a man. There's no such thing as a woman. Biological sex doesn't matter. It's basically, whatever you decide you are is what you are. This is exactly the valueless value of capitalism. A spoon, let me just finish this point. A spoon, a car, the sofa that's sitting in your office, these things have no value in and of themselves. Their value is completely determined by the market. This is the value. This is the way capitalism works. And it does that by stripping the original despotic value off of these things so that they can be free floating and they can obtain value through exchange value. And this is the same thing that I see happening here.
I mean, I think that from a philosophical standpoint, I think it's really interesting conceptually. And I obviously I do worship at the altar of capitalism. So I would disagree in that it is not a good thing overall. I still think capitalism is a very good thing because of the benefits it can have for society and raising people out of poverty and forming cultures in exchange. But I do understand the point you're making, and I do agree with the point that you're making about it stripping away and monetizing cultural aspects, religious aspects, and also because, and this is something interesting to see play out with Black Lives Matter, for instance, right? All of these corporations, at least regionally, put out Black Lives Matter statements of support. We support this and we support that. And they do this with many issues. Transgender issues, I'm sure, is the same thing. But you do see them say, okay, we are now going to adopt what we view as what's going to be the winning strategy. Whatever culture is going to be the winning strategy, we are now going to align ourselves with that, regardless of whether or not they believe it or not. But because it is advantageous to the company, the corporation, and for them to possibly monetize that in the future, or at least not lose any money by virtue of people coming at them and trying to provide a backlash.
I think I disagree a little bit with that because I just again I go a little deeper with it. I don't think that the corporations are co-opting. I mean, to some extent, sure, they're co-opting whatever is popular, but I think it's deeper than that. Again, I think that what the system, what the global capitalist system, needs to do is to erase, all of the old values. Before global capitalism, what was there? There were nation states. Right? The nation states, they existed for a while. Before that, there were, the empires and the word I'm looking for, kingdoms. Yes. And what's happening, I think we're in another transition phase. There was a transition phase where we went from, the rule of kings, and aristocracies to the rule of nation states, right? And we're in another transition phase now where we're transitioning from the rule of nation states to the rule of global capitalism.
Well, Rollerball hit the nail on the head with this. Have you ever seen that movie?
I'm sorry?
It's a ridiculous reference. The movie Rollerball with James Caan.
Oh, yeah. I wish I'd remembered it better.
It's basically the corporations had taken over nation states. This is not an original concept. And it's sorry to break in, but I want to point out something that I thought was kind of funny that just popped in my mind, though, is that, and I'm enjoying a philosophical conversation on this, by the way, but I do think it's kind of interesting in that I'd almost say that you are creating with this viewpoint, this philosophical stance. It's almost leftist conservatism, in that you're fighting against the new wave of capitalism and wanting to conserve the old ways, the old cultures, and as you said, allegiances to what was of the past, and be that cultural or religious or king based, or region based. And there is something to that, but at the same time, I mean, it's almost inevitable. I think just with the way that communications happen, that you're going to have a breakdown of these specific cultural bents no matter what. And at the same time, I do lament that. And I'm with you in that I do believe that cultures are important to keep and that things should be remembered and should not be torn down. But I wouldn't necessarily put that at the feet of capitalism specifically, but more so just as far as it's inevitable once we have this advancing of technology that capitalism is the thing that's going to unite people more than anything, because you don't have to argue so much about whose God is correct, or what religion is correct, or what gender is correct, when we can simply exchange goods and everybody can enjoy a good sit down on the futon.
Yeah, no, and Brian, just for you and your libertarian listeners, again, I think the distinction that I'm making is there's a distinction between capitalism as an economic system
and as a power structure, and
capitalism as an ideology is what I'm talking about. You can, for example, capitalism functioned throughout most of the period of nation states. Mm-hmm. And yet national cultures, still maintained their values as national cultures. Mm-hmm. And capitalism was, to one degree or another, the economic system within those societies. And what I'm talking about when I say global capitalism, and when I'm talking all this philosophical stuff, what I'm talking about is this economic system being elevated or transformed into an ideological system, mm-hmm. right? Where now it's not just satisfied to function and to run the economy, but it now becomes the ideology to which everyone must conform, such that yes, people have the freedom to believe in whatever. They can be Christians, they can be Muslims, they can be Jews, and what have you. But Globocap mm-hmm. Needs to go over to the Middle East and restructure the fuck out of that place.
Right, yeah. Which is effectively what America has been trying to do over the past 50 years.
Why? And I don't even see it as America. I see it as Globocap. Yeah. And the reason that the Middle East needs to be restructured is there are actually people over there who are trying to live according to theocratic values. And you can't run a marketplace with people living according to theocratic values.
It's certainly limited if you can.
it screws the marketplace right up.
Right.
It's fine if they say they believe in whatever and they go to the mosque and go to the church and what have you. But if they're actually trying to run their whole society based on theocratic values, that's an impediment to the market.
Yeah.
And this is and this is what I'm talking about. To get it back to what you were saying, the idea of there being men and women and having sex, biological sex, this is also an impediment to the marketplace. It's the same machine, Brian. Dissolving one set of values here, dissolving one set of values there. If it helps you and your libertarian listeners, it's not capitalism, the economic system, that is doing this. Mm-hmm. It is global capitalism as an ideological power structure.
Yeah, I think we could get behind that. Don't worry. I think having clarified it and going deeper in the conversation definitely clarifies what you're talking about more. And I think that a lot of my audience would agree with what you're saying. And that, as I said, it's definitely something economically support. But again, getting into what we're talking about earlier, global power structure, companies and governments working hand in hand to push, as you said, the ideology is something completely different. So I think we are in agreement. We went a long way around, but I think we're in agreement.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Just tell me a little bit, what are you working on now? Where can people find, I said Consent Factory, but where else can people find your work? And I just want to say, I've had a wonderful time speaking with you. And if opportunity presents itself, I'd love to have you back on again sometime.
I'd be happy to come on anytime. Actually, this is, just one of the best interviews that I've had. Someone let me get into all of the crazy philosophical stuff that is what I think is really interesting. I think it's important too, Brian, because I think we are really still at the beginning of a very huge transitional shift, which is the end of the Cold War. And, power regimes are changing, ideological regimes are changing. And I don't think anyone has the answers to, what comes next and where we're going. So I just think it's important that people think about these things. You can get my stuff. I mean, you can Google me, you can go to the Consent Factory. You can get my books anywhere. As I said, pretty much any online bookseller has them. Or you can walk into your local bookstore if you still have a local bookstore. And what I'm working on right now, I'm trying to put together volume 2 of those Consent Factory essays, which covers the years 2018 and 2019. Volume 1 was 2016 and 2017, which is why I subtitled it the Trumpocalypse. Yes, and the horror appeared. And these years that I'm covering now are exactly, it's Russiagate, it's the rise of Russiagate, the fall of Russiagate, and also really the rollout of the whole fascism hysteria that the corporate media has been pumping out. So that's what's next for me.
All right, fantastic. Well, I will definitely be reading and sharing as much as I can. Again, I really enjoy your writing style. I am greatly enjoying Zone 23. I'm about a quarter of the way through, and I was trying to finish more of that up to get into a little bit more, but with a 4-month-old baby at home, time is tough to come by these days. But yeah, greatly enjoying it so far. It's very, very dystopian. And as I said, really plays well into the propaganda machine, tying into the view pads, the all-encompassing view pads, and kind of, big screens, broadcasting the day's propaganda, and also the corporatization. And again, I would say crony capitalism of the media worshiping at the altar of these all-powerful corporate entities that are then engaged by the state to impose draconian laws upon the populace. So that's all I can say about it for now, but really enjoying it.
Glad to hear it.
Yeah. And just so thank you very much for joining us. And I guess I'll hope to have you on soon.
It's been a pleasure, Brian. Anytime.
So that wraps up my interview with the great CJ Hopkins. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And as always, anytime I have somebody that doesn't go lockstep with libertarianism, I expect some pushback and feedback. Of course, you can go comment, weigh in, join the conversation at the Lions of Liberty Forum. You can join that on Facebook. Just type in Lions of Liberty Forum, and it'll ask you where you heard the show. Just say you heard it right here from your good pal, Brian McWilliams. Just want to make sure you're not some nutball spammer. So yeah, come on in, weigh in. We can talk about the philosophy of capitalism, the ideology versus the economy. And I think it'll be a good time. But it's always nice to engage people that aren't in complete lockstep with you. This is how you expand your mind. As we were talking about, it's always good to not only expand your mind and look at other viewpoints, but guys, this is how you sharpen your arguments. This is how you sharpen your effectiveness to communicate. Because if you're just going to yell slogans at somebody, you're not going to get through to them ever. So thanks again to CJ Hopkins for joining us. I want to give some shout outs at the end of the show too. First and foremost to Alex Horseman over at Libertas Bellas. And they just started this company. It's a brand new t-shirt company. I, myself, am rocking a new Tiananmen Square t-shirt. Love it. And Alex is a good dude. Hung out with him at PorkFest. He was also with ammo.com for a while and helped throw us some support from that company. So please do check them out. And I'll post a photo of myself in the Lions of Liberty Forum. You can find them at libertasbella.com. Of course, Libertas Bella means beautiful liberty. And also, as always, I want to give a shout out to Goulash Media and Dan Smots of the Systems Down podcast, who has helped me out with all the graphic design stuff that I like to do. Rico and Odie and I, by the way, just launched a new comedy review podcast for Bravo and TLC shows called Bravo and Beer. And of course, Dan helped out with the logo for that as well. So check that out. It's going to be funny. It's going to be very non-political. So it's a good one to watch, listen to with your wife. It's definitely going to be explicit. It's definitely still going to be us, but just talking about the dumbest of reality TV and giving our trademarked take on it. I'll say that. So guys, again, from me, Brian McWilliams, I want to remind you, listen to Mark on Mondays with the flagship Lions of Liberty show. And of course, John Odermatt with the very vital Felony Friday, looking at criminal justice reform. Otherwise, I'll be here for you every single Wednesday. So for me, Brian McWilliams, from the Lions of Liberty and from Electric Libertyland, always stay plugged into liberty.